You're playing Halo Infinite's campaign for the first time. On your travels throughout Zeta Halo, you come across a vast woodland biome and hear a broken distress signal from a squad of surviving Marines. Within this forest, you make your way inside a Forerunner structure. It's dark and quiet. Too quiet. The signature hum of many Forerunner constructs is only heard faintly in this place. The first thing you see after venturing further into the building is blood, smeared up the walls, red, purple, blue, but no bodies to be found. You think maybe a firefight took place here between some banished and that Marine squad, to try and put your mind at ease, dreading the possibility of it being something else, something worse. As you make your way further into the facility, a green mist slowly starts to obscure your vision. Even your helmet's flashlights can't cut through fog this thick. But you can make out a singular light, a doorway. Within the frame of the door, a silhouette. The outline becomes more apparent, it's a Marine. You lower your weapon, glad to see a familiar face, as you were now within speaking distance. Then suddenly, the figure turns. The silhouette, while human, is twisted, mangled, a long, sharp series of claws where an arm once was, the head barely clinging to the shoulders of this rotting, pulsating green mold of flesh and bone, and lets out an ungodly scream, a scream that you dreaded of hearing ever again, as all around you more shadows start to appear within the fog. They have waited through rock and metal and time, and now the Flood have returned. Hello there, ghouls, ghosts, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Lepaladin, and in today's special Halloween-themed episode, we're going to be tackling the topic of the Flood, everyone's favourite bodily possessing intelligent parasite, last seen during the events of Halo Wars 2's final story DLC, Awakening the Nightmare. The Flood are one of the most beloved factions in Halo and are quite possibly the most important driving force of development within Halo's story. Without the Flood, the Forerunners would never have built the Halo rings, and without the Halo rings, well, what are you going to call this series of games? John the Green Shooty Boy who isn't afraid of anything? It doesn't quite have the same simplicity and marketability as just Halo. So today, that was me bumping my microphone. So today I'm going to throw in my 2 cents and my crappy opinion in an attempt to answer the question that is undoubtedly on the minds of longtime Halo fans everywhere. Does Halo Infinite need the Flood? In a game that has to pick up a lot of plot threads from Halo 5 and even some from Halo Wars 2, it seems like Infinite is already dealing with a lot in its story department. We've got plenty to cover in the game, ranging from what happened between the events of Halo 5 and Infinite, what were the after effects of Cortana's AI uprising and its impact on the galaxy at large, or at the very least on humanity. Why are the Banished on Zeta Halo, and what is their goal for being there? What's the deal with the Harbinger? Who is the weapon, and why is she impersonating my favourite blue e-girl? And how the hell did Chief end up floating in the great big cosmic backyard? Not to mention 343's efforts to make this game approachable to new players by supposedly simplifying this game's story and making it a spiritual reboot. I remember reading somewhere, I think it might have been Frank O'Connor, who mentioned that Infinite's story picks up in a very similar way to Combat Evolved's, where you're thrust into this world after a massive battle took place that you're not 100% sure on the timeline and events of. To me, this screams that Infinite is going to tread very lightly when it comes to referencing past Halo games, and will have a story predominantly leaning towards new players, while presumably appealing to older fans in other ways. Like the game's nostalgic location, a general change in direction from the last 2 games that pays respects to the series' roots, art style, etc. So, to me, it appears as though the chances of the Flood making an appearance are looking more and more desperate. A spiritual reboot, simpler story, lots of questions that need to be answered. Unless Infinite wants a nasty case of Amazing Spider-Man 2 syndrome, I think it would be best to keep things straightforward. However, that doesn't mean that I don't think we'll see the Flood at all in Infinite. Allow me to introduce my good friend, Campaign DLC. I briefly touched on this idea in one of my earlier videos talking about what we could expect from Infinite's 10 years of post-launch content. The big thing that I wanted to see was Campaign DLC. I feel as though it'd be very implausible for us to have to wait 10 years, maybe more, to see a continuation of Chief and the Weapons story, along with the cost of the campaign being full price when we're not really paying for a full price game. I'm not going to get into that argument again, but allow me to theorize a little bit. I've been reading a bunch of Halo books lately in preparation for Infinite, the most recent one of which was Point of Light. Now, there's a lot of stuff to break down in this book, and if you haven't been keeping up with this series, it's skits, all right? Like, 343 Guilty Spark is back, Sergeant Forge has a daughter, it's crazy. So, obviously, spoilers ahead if you haven't read that. But if you don't care, then fine, you know? But the most important part that's relevant to the Flood is that there are apparently, like all other Halo installations we've come across, Flood specimens in containment on Installation 07. The installation's monitor, 117-649 Despondent Pyre, was also seemingly MIA, meaning that in the event of a containment breach, it would be very unlikely for there to be someone overlooking the situation and coordinating Zeta Halo's defenses. Now, what's the one thing we know about Infinite's campaign? That the ring is messed up, badly. A massive conflict took place off-screen prior to the events of the game's campaign, and someone, either the Banished, UNSC, or even Cortana's created, severely damaged the ring, which presumably would make containing a Flood outbreak even more difficult. Parts of the ring that house Flood specimens could potentially be without power, or even the tiniest bit of damage to a Flood containment unit. Well, we've all played Halo 3, we know the quote.
One single flood spore can destroy a species.
During the conflict taking place between the Banished and UNSC on Zeta Halo, it's very possible that the Flood have been slowly spreading across broken off chunks of the ring, or potentially gaining numbers while the two major factions have been too busy fighting each other to realize there is a major threat growing right under their noses. And with no monitor to warn either side of the Flood outbreak, well, it might already be too late to nip this in the bud, leading to an uneasy alliance between humans and the many species within the Banished in a final desperate attempt to stop an enemy that's bigger than them both. As Captain Jonathan Pryce once wisely said,
"You ever hear the old saying, the enemy of my enemy is my friend?"
Alternatively, and this is a theory I subscribe more to, speaking of subscribing, that's definitely something you should do, the Flood outbreak on the Ark. Halo Wars 2 left us on a bit of a cliffhanger. Seeing as we're probably never going to get a Halo Wars 3, as unfortunately sales for the last game were kind of underwhelming. I'm not crying, you are. I think the least 343 could do to finish up Halo Wars 2's narrative, giving that ongoing story and fans of it some closure, would be to tie it into Infinite's. Awakening the Nightmare established that the Flood had been stewing away in the bowels of High Charity for years after the events of Halo 3, and hadn't completely died out after the firing of Alpha Halo 2 Electric Boogaloo. While Atriox's commanders Voridus and Pavium were successful in cleansing the Flood threat that they basically started, and destroying the Proto-Gravemind that was alive on the Ark, I have no doubt that this is not an isolated incident. It took the elites multiple Covenant cruisers to glass over half of Africa, right? Africa. It's a damn big place in order to wipe out a small infection of Flood, let alone one that had spread pretty far and wide across the surface of the Ark from its original starting point. I wouldn't even be surprised if the Banished's reasoning for coming to Zeta Halo was to find a way to stop the Flood outbreak from spreading beyond the surface of the Ark. The Banished don't really seem like the type of guys to talk about their problems or ask for help, so who knows, maybe the Banished fled to Zeta Halo because they were running from something that was far worse than the after effects of Atriox's special recipe for Banished Bean Bonanza.
You made fucking beans, what the fuck?
Zeta Halo was, after all, the home of many awful experiments hundreds of thousands of years ago made to try and find a cure to the Flood. Every man and his dog has seen the hidden Xperia videos on the Palace of Pain, so I won't get into that, but maybe the Banished thought that some of the Forerunner research might still be here on the ring. And how would the crew of the Spirit of Fire be holding up? The conflict between the Banished on the Ark had seemingly come to a stalemate, and with the Flood being introduced to the conflict, how would that shape their rivalry? The other, lesser-known outbreak could potentially be millions of light years away from us on the other side of the galaxy. When the Flood infected High Charity, they would have had access to thousands of ships capable of interstellar travel, ranging from ships like the Covenant cruiser that crashed into New Mombasa, all the way to dropships like Phantoms. While the elites were quick to set up a contamination zone around High Charity in hopes of stopping any Flood from spreading outside the Holy Space Mushroom, what's the bet that they missed a few? If High Charity was still able to move through slip space, surely there's a chance that somewhere along the way they dropped off a couple of infected ships or dispersal pods. The Flood are, well and truly, an unstoppable force, not just because of their overwhelming numbers but also their patience. They disappeared for several decades during the Forerunner Flood War, only to come back stronger than ever. What's to say they won't do the same thing again? But what about in places other than the campaign? Halo is no stranger to having the Flood present in multiplayer game types. In both Halo 4 and Halo 2 Anniversary's version of the Infection game mode, the infected Spartans were given a grisly makeover that was unfortunately absent from Halo 5. So will Halo Infinite's Infection return to having a different Flood-themed character model for infected players? I seriously hope so. If not for the scare factor, then one other very important reason. Infinite's Forge mode is shaping up to be the most ambitious in the series. For those who aren't aware, and I'm going to get into leak territory here, Forge is looking to have a multitude of AI pathing options in the form of nodes. I'm not smart enough to realistically explain to you how they work, but the possibility of having AI on Forge maps, really taking scripting to a whole other level, could just be around the corner, and somewhat softens the blow that Forge is set to be delayed for at least 6 months. This opens up a whole new can of worms. Custom campaign levels, game modes like Slayer or Capture the Flag could now have AI mixed in with the players, and I'm not just talking about the bots from training mode. I mean enemy AI from the campaign with their mannerisms and traits. This could lead to community-made firefight maps and so much more. I think you can tell where I'm going with this. If 343 aren't going to bring the Flood back within an official capacity, what's to stop the community from doing it?
Fine. I'll do it myself.
For years, a personal favourite mode of mine has been linear infection maps and game modes. You and a team of survivors push through a map and wait for triggered events to happen or knock through some doors yourselves to get to the next stage and eventually a final holdout area. These have proven to be immensely popular in the Master Chief Collection custom games browser, and I can't help but imagine how much more fun they'd be with the inclusion of AI on these maps as well. Why start out with 2 infected players when you can have a whole horde of Flood rushing your way to start the match? Why have actual people start off as the infected, which will likely just piss them off, when you can get AI to do it? Imagine all the game modes like Fat Kid, Toilet, and Get Out of My House, where waves upon waves of infected get killed without so much as a second worth of breathing room. AI will never get tired of being constantly killed and shot at over and over again. They'll never leave the match or go AFK because they've given up. They are the perfect solution to this problem. If the Flood aren't in Infinite's campaign, I think it'd be a massive missed opportunity to not have Flood character models available as AI in the Forge mode. As a 10-year live service game, I think it's incredibly likely that we will see the Flood again in some capacity. Maybe not during the game's initial release, maybe not even within the next few years, but eventually, they will be back. Whether that's in the form of a surprise reveal, or an inclusion in a multiplayer game mode, or in Forge, you can't keep a good villain down for long. Like water,
Always finding a way through the cracks. The Flood.
I am never impersonating D. Bradley Baker again. Oh, God.